Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us here on the Dave Emmons Show. And my guest today is Charles Christian. And we're going to do an hour with him. And he's a very interesting person as we read a little bit of his bio, let you know what he does. But he's from the UK, our sister country or whatever, motherland, whatever we want to call it. But I have so many friends in the UK. These are really nice people. They've always treated me good. Either way, I was either as a guest or our host. It doesn't matter, but they're always great people. I wish, that I guess that could spread around the world. that kind of a good behavior. Like I said, this is Dave Emmons Show, and I'm Dave Emmons. And my guest, Charles Christian, he is an English barrister and Reuters correspondent turned writer, editor, podcaster, and award-winning tech journalist. The Urban Fantasist website is home to his tales of geek culture, folklore, urban myths, history, and weird, as well as anything else that intrigues him. His best known book is writing genre fiction, creating imaginary worlds, and the 12 Rules is one of them. He also writes and presents the weekly Weird Tales radio show. And yeah, he's a radio guy, so I gotta be on my tippy toes on this one. So, and yes, the UK national newspaper once really did commission him to. This is the exciting story. I guess the UK national newspaper once commissioned him to go on a werewolf hunt on the night of a full moon. Spoiler alert. I won't tell you. I won't tell you. So, and in 2017, he was named Sage UK as one of the UK's top 100 business influencers in his capacity as an individual whose commentary and social influence helped to drive ideas and change within the small business sector. He was born with a cowl over his face. You like to explain that too, and also the word fantasist. You'll have to explain that one too. Did he always, especially to me too? And so, according to legend, the cowl shrouded chime child can't drown at sea, but can see ghosts and talk to fairy folk without fear of coming to harm. Superpowers he so far never needed to use. He's written 6 books, and these books are writing genre fiction, creating imaginary worlds, Yorkshire's weird wolds, saints and sinners in Dark Age England. This is the quickest way down, the mysterious world, Newton Triangle, Struckland, weird tales, ghosts, folklore, and legends from East Anglia. He's past shows. He's been on Star Wars sets, Yorkshire Lower, TWA Flight 800, UK Folklore, and Creatures. And that's part of his background. And I'm sure he has a lot more to what's going on with himself. And we're going to get into that. Charles Christian, is there anything you'd like to add or talk about?
No. I mean, that was wonderful bio you've given me. I've got a hard act to follow on that.
I know, but the couple of words that wold. That's W-O-L.
Wold.
Yeah, wold. Yeah, that's the way you guys pronounce it. And
wold. Yes.
Yeah.
And, it's a geological term for hills that are made of limestone.
Right.
Okay. We have it in Yorkshire. We have the Yorkshire Wolds, which are made of limestone, and the other side of the county are the Yorkshire Wolds, the Yorkshire Moors, which are a different type of terrain.
Right. Sorry for those little chimes that you just heard. That's a chime from my front door.
That's all right.
Expecting an Amazon delivery. I'm so sorry. And my wife is down there. So, okay. But now let's get in that fantasist. What is that now?
Well, it's urban fantasist. So it's like urban fantasy. But I did it as urban fantasist. So it really just describes just a name I coined. It doesn't have any particular meaning. Rather like urban legends, urban fantasy stories.
Like sci-fi.
I'm the guy who's writing them, so I'm the urban fantasist.
All right. Yeah, I need to add this too. We're being syndicated through radio station WODY in Maryland, Eddie Carson is the man that I contact there. OdysseyRadioLive.com. That's OdysseyRadioLive.com. You can catch us on the audio portion on that. And I figured I better get that in there before we got too much into the hour. So, Christian, where would you like to start, or Mr. Christian? Where would you like to start telling us some of your most fantastic stories?
Well, I suppose the beginning would be what got me into doing this, because as you mentioned, I used to be a barrister. Those are the English lawyers who wear
Right.
the wigs and gowns. And then I became a technology journalist for many years. And how did I end up here? And I suppose it's all because um, back as a child, I lived in a distinctly spooky house, and we had a family where we would people would tell ghost stories over Christmas and on dark nights and things, and some would be fictional and some would be, experiences either they'd had or members of their family had had. So I sort of grew up with a tradition of folklore and folk stories and ghost stories and aspects of the paranormal. And I live in England, and as anybody who's been to England knows, it's full of ancient ruins and history and ghost stories. And my parents were both interested in this, and we'd go off on trips on Sunday afternoons, which is what we used to do in those days when cars were, we're talking the 1950s, when, people were first starting to get lots of cars, and we'd go out on outings, and we'd go out to either an old castle or an old abbey or ruins of them, or an old stately home. And I just soaked up the stories and the atmosphere, and it sort of all went in there. And then at some point, much later, when I was able to not be spending so much time doing the day job of being a tech journalist, I started writing and talking about these issues. And as you say, I used to do a podcast. I've actually stopped the podcast now, but I am doing some videos, and I've been focusing in more recent times
And
on
those are a lot of
writing.
work. A lot of people don't understand. Are a
They
lot of
are.
work.
It was
Yeah. And
a lot of admin, and it was a case of, if I'm going to be writing books and I'd got some commissions for books, I'd got to cut back on the other stuff
yes,
and
same
say
way here. Yeah. Same way here.
the
Yeah.
podcast had to go.
Since we're talking about your younger years, you said you were born with a cowl over your
Yeah.
face, and that's an
Now,
indicator of a special child.
yeah, and a call is it's part of the membrane that you're born in, and um, the it's perfectly natural. There are thousands of births every year with people with calls on, but because it's the sac containing amniotic fluid, which is slightly salty, that the fetus has been in. The legend grew up that as you are basically born with a bag of salt water over your face and were born healthy, the call would be good luck for anybody who was at sea, and that you supposedly wouldn't drown in the sea, because you'd already been born living in seawater.
Right.
And it's very much a sort of a 18th and 19th century thing. And you see in old newspapers advertisements for people offering calls for sale for 20 guineas, which in 19th century terms was a huge amount of money. I think in the Dickens story, David Copperfield, he's born with a call, and his wicked stepfather sells it and doesn't give him the money for it. But say, so there's this legend.
Yeah,
That,
very famous legends there, right?
yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to get into. I also was born with gray sideburns. My mom told me that, so maybe that's why the ETs mess with me so much. I wanted to get into some of the other points that you talked about and which were interesting. You said something about there's a third way, an alternative explanation for the paranormal. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I've been, particularly when I was doing my own podcast, talking to lots of people, and I found that there seemed to be this split between the people who are the believers, that they believe in the paranormal, and the people who are the absolute skeptics. And let's boil it down to, say, UFOs or UAPs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are the people that if they see any light in the sky, they will say it's a UFO, and the skeptics will say no, it's a meteorological balloon. They'll come up with all the various explanations that why it's not a UFO.
Mm-hmm.
But as we know from releases of things like Project Blue Book and the more recent US Navy revelations, although when you look at the figures, there are explanations for an awful lot of these phenomena, that they can be attributed to um, aircraft, satellites, the planets, etc. Even back in the 1950s with Project Blue Book, they still had somewhere between 10 and 20% that couldn't be explained.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't saying, oh, must be aliens then, like the History Channel guy, but they couldn't be explained. We didn't know what the answer was. And it strikes me, the more I've been talking and to people on, if you like, both sides of the divide, there is an awful lot of stuff that we simply don't know the answer to. And it doesn't fit in with the views of the, if we like, the orthodox scientific community. And it also clashes to an extent with what the, if we like, the believers have about it.
I agree with you. A lot of ufologists, even today, a lot of the talking heads are the so-called experts that are out there in front. They're the ones making all the money, and the experiencers are providing them with the stories so they can make their money.
Yeah.
But I wrote my own book, so it's about me. So I didn't take it all from other people. But that's fine doing that. But the talking heads seem to control, or they're the gatekeepers for stories that get out there. Some stories get out that are not as great as some other stories, but they don't let them through. And the talking heads and the ufologists ourselves are our own worst enemies also.
Yeah. We had this in the UK with an incident Rendlesham Forest,
Right.
which was in 1980, and it's generally spoken of as the UK's Roswell.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at a US airbase, and strange lights were seen, and there was lots of commotion, and various armed troops going into the nearby woods to try and find out what the light was, what it was. And there's various explanations for it. But as you say, the experts have got in there, and there are some people who have made a living for the last 40 years talking about the truth about Rendlesham, and they weren't even there. They weren't,
Yes.
They weren't there. They just picked it up, and the story's gone on, and they are the quote unquote expert on the subject.
Maybe they're better communicators or orator than the actual experiencer, and that's probably why they step out in front.
Well, I think that's it. The better experience, and obviously, it being a military situation, the commanding officer at the time and the senior officers, they're under constraints, and they just can't go public and start saying, oh yeah, we had an encounter with a UFO. You just don't do that if you're in the military in a senior position.
By the way, Charles, I love the English accent, always did, and I'm always jealous when I'm talking to you UK guys. I love the way you place words, and you're very literature minded, in which a lot of myself, I'm not. When in college, literature was not my favorite cup of tea, but we're getting into, I guess we're talking about academia also is turning their backs on the UFO because I guess they get government subsidies and government funding in their colleges, and they're afraid to go against the government, right?
Well, there is that. There's also this whole scientific orthodoxy, and you see that not so much just with UFOs, but with other aspects of what we might call the paranormal, such as cryptozoology.
Mm-hmm.
And um, the nature of science these days is it's a career, and you want to be on the ladder, the career ladder, and you want security of tenure if you're a lecturer there, and you want to be moving up to becoming a professor and everything like that. And so it tends to inhibit people from being outspoken, that
Right.
they will err on the side of caution and scientific orthodoxy
Right.
rather than stick their necks out. I mean, this is a great shame, because if you go back in time, with to the 19th century, when, for example, the Society for Psychical Research was set up in the UK, and similar one was set up in North America to look after, was ghosts was one of the things, but it was also, that was the great era of the psychic mediums, and they were exploring that. And when you looked at the membership, there were conventional scientists who were, in established areas, physics, chemistry, whatever, and they were happily investigating these mysteries. They weren't sort of saying, "Oh, what will people think if they hear I'm investigating things like this? They'll think I'm a bit of a crank or something." And that spirit of adventure seems to have gone with scientists now, and it's very much settled down for the orthodoxy. So, endlessly, when it comes to cryptids of any form, you have all the various explanations why, the Loch Ness monster can't exist, why Bigfoot is a hoax, and so on. Whereas every year, new creatures are being discovered. Obviously,
Right.
not big, exciting creatures, but new species are being discovered, and they're being discovered in places where previously we would have thought life was impossible, like all these creatures being found on the seabed next to thermal vents. They're under huge pressure, that great pressures at the bottom of the sea that submarines can't withstand. They're living on the edge of volcanic outlets, and they are thriving. And these are all creatures which a few years ago people would have said, things like that, how could they possibly exist?
Are there other possibilities, Charles, like maybe like ETs or somebody's creating these creatures, even us humans creating these creatures, like the Montauk animal that they had in Montauk, and they created these animals in a lab and set them loose, and they start growing in numbers. Is that possible too?
I don't know about ETs doing it. I think you have to, bearing in mind, it could well be the result of experiments, but
Right.
by just straightforward humans. I mean, there remains this theory that COVID escaped from a lab and was originally intended as a biological weapon. And certainly there's a lot of reports, the American government actually was funding some of the labs in Wuhan. And
Yeah.
they do experiment with certain diseases and germs on the
So
basis
yeah,
of,
this
if you know how they work, then you can develop countermeasures for them. And it escaped, but there, how much of it is the militarization of diseases. You know, I mean, I've spoken to people who have pointed out that tick infestations, Lyme's disease in North America, is on the growth and seems to have peaked or first started being centered on former military research establishments.
What you're talking about is the whole world is in a conundrum with this idea of fake news, disinformation, misinformation, hiding the truth from us. A lot of people, and I've been doing some research, writing this Angels book now, and I've gotten into a lot of research in Enoch and all the ancient biblical stories, finding out that there's a lot of stuff that we don't know about, and we don't. And what's going on in the world now? A lot of people just they're not paying any attention. Most people are ignorant of what's really going on politically and right under our feet. There's a statement here you put there. M.R. James' view: I am prepared to consider evidence and accept it if it satisfies me. That quote means something to you. What does it mean?
Yeah, well, M.R. James, Montague Road James, is a famous writer of supernatural horror stories as at the Edwardian period, so sort of 1910, 1920s period. He was also an academic and in library sciences and book research, and was head of Eton College and was at one of the Cambridge colleges. So a pure academic on one hand, but on the other hand, had this fascination and used to write ghost stories, which in the UK are particularly very popular, and they're usually broadcast as go out on television as a Christmas ghost story every year, and have done for about 50 years or so.
I always love watching those documentaries from England. You know, we have ghost hunters that go over to England from America to look at these castles and everything that are haunted. Yeah, you guys have a history. I mean, we don't have the history you guys have. You guys go back thousands of years. Our country goes back 300-400 years. Yeah, but the Indians were here. The Native American Indians were here, but they didn't comprise of structures that we did. So I guess we're new, you know, and you guys have a history.
Yeah. Well, I say M.R. James was asked, you know, what did he personally believe about ghosts? And his view was he's prepared to consider the evidence and accept it if it satisfies me. And I think that's the view that I take. I haven't seen a ghost, but that doesn't mean I don't believe they don't exist. It just means that I haven't seen one. And I'm perfectly willing to accept that other people have had these experiences rather than say nonsense doesn't exist.
Yeah, I've asked this question to a lot of experts. I'm going to ask it about you. You're an expert in this area too. What's the difference between a ghost, poltergeist, ET, and maybe even an angel that is invisible? Are they all dimensional?
It's a good question. That, I mean, poltergeists possibly are more human oriented and psychological than an awful lot of cases where it seems to center on the activities, either deliberate or subconscious, of a young person going through puberty, and that there's some kind of psychic energy they're giving off, and that the poltergeist is activity is being caused by them, I say, either deliberately or unconsciously. As for the others, I mean, this is where you get into this idea of, are we in a sort of a multi-dimensional? The best analogy I've heard is it's like living in an apartment block, and there are people living above you, and there are people living below you, and you occasionally hear noises from the people living above you, and you hear noises from the people living below you, maybe footsteps, maybe music, whatever. But you don't ever meet them. You don't actually encounter them. And is that really what we are seeing? And that ghosts are some kind of echo from the past, and ETs who are in the floor above us are perhaps echoes or crossovers from the future or another dimension, whether their ETs are actually extraterrestrials or the other theory that is out that ETs may actually be humans who've evolved from the future who are time travelers.
Right.
And, what will we look like in 100,000 years' time? If they're a long way in the future. And that, it is a dimensional element. And there's just this crossover just occasionally. And I say you get the same story with things like portals and certain times of the year and certain places that are said to be haunted. And, in England, we have lots of traditions surrounding standing stones, that there's something there, that they're a liminal point, and that if you are there sometimes you cross over and you can encounter people from the future or people from the past. And in England, we tend to also have fairy folk in there, as another kind of interdimensional being that lives parallel to us, but normally separate from us. But just on occasions, we cross over and see each other.
Leprechauns and, these little people. I just saw a documentary on that. And there was actually a guy who had some real pictures or video of these little people, running around through the woods and leaves and everything. It seemed like real, but you can make those things up. We got a lot of computer generated stuff that goes on now, and which causes a lot of that. Now, a lot of this technology, like UFOs and things of that nature, you talked about time travelers. They're saying it could be our enemies that have a technology, but I don't believe so. Is that your opinion too?
I don't believe it's so either. There certainly will be experimental craft from potential enemies, which in the modern world is basically China and Russia, that are out there, just as in the same way during the Second World War, American pilots were reporting Foo Fighters, which may have been a advanced Nazi technology, and they did have some very advanced technology that fortunately they weren't able to bring out in sufficient volumes to influence the war.
Okay, we're going to have to hold that thought, Charles. We got Charles Christian. We're up on the bottom of our break, and you're listening to the Dave Emmons Show. My guest, Charles Christian from the UK, and he's got some more. There's some more fantastic stories. I want to hear it next year. We're going to get into cryptids, and I want to know more about that. It's also being broadcasted on WODY Radio out of Maryland, and it's Eddie Carson, and the show is OdysseyRadioLive.com. We'll be right back.